What happens when the people who are responsible for saving your life end up taking it instead? From doctors who unalived patients for money to nurses who unalived for the thrill, here are 20 cases where medical professionals turned against their patients. Christopher Duntsch.
At 6 o'clock, a former North Texas doctor learning that he will spend the rest of his life in prison.
That was the sentence today for Christopher Duntsch. His victims say their lives are ruined from the surgeries he botched on purpose.
Over the span of a little under 3 years, Christopher Duntsch performed 38 surgeries and maimed 33 of them, resulting in the unaliving of 2 patients. In the final review by the Texas Medical Board in 2013, surgeons Christopher had worked with called him a sociopath and accused him of intentionally injuring his patients. Still, it took the Texas Medical Board longer than it should have to revoke Christopher's medical license. Why? Because no one could believe that a neurosurgeon was as incompetent as he was. Before he joined Baylor Plano, Christopher had earned his medical degree from the University of Tennessee, later pursuing a residency program in neurosurgery. Alarm bells started going off during Christopher's residency when he was reprimanded more than a few times for operating while under the influence of hard substances. Altogether, Christopher participated in fewer than 200 surgeries during his residency, while other surgeons would typically participate in over 1,000. But Christopher avoided suspicion by focusing more on the PhD part of his specialty, only transferring back to active surgery some years after graduating. At Baylor Plano, Christopher's technical skills as a surgeon, or even his knowledge of basic human anatomy, were put into question several times. According to the people he worked with, Christopher was incapable of properly handling a scalpel. He managed to botch almost all of his surgeries, leading to his patients suffering from lifetime chronic pain, salvage surgeries, and at least one patient, a friend of Christopher's, ending up as a quadriplegic and ultimately passing away. Baylor Plano did not immediately report Christopher, but they quietly let him go, after which he joined Dallas Medical Center.
Everyone involved in that case, from the scrub techs to the x-ray tech to myself to the anesthesiologist, gave each other looks many times during that case because we just didn't understand what he was doing.
He was allowed to temporarily, under supervision, perform 2 surgeries while his records from Baylor Plano were transferred. Both surgeries were botched. One led to the unaliving of a patient. The hospital's other neurosurgeon, who later had to perform salvage surgeries, noted that Christopher had operated on the wrong side of the spine, severed arteries that should not have been touched, and altogether maimed the patient with his botched job. Dallas Medical Center tried to contact the University of Tennessee, almost certain that Christopher was an imposter, but was shocked to learn that his degree and qualifications were legitimate.
Dr. Christopher Duntsch calls himself the best neurosurgeon in all of Dallas. He specializes in relieving back and neck pain.
Then they come back to me to discuss surgical options.
Still, they decided to let him go, but this time, Christopher was reported to the Texas Medical Board. While his license was ultimately revoked in 2013, surgeons who had worked with him were afraid he would reinstate his license. 3 of Christopher's victims were motivated to file civil lawsuits of medical malpractice against Christopher, leading to a chain reaction. In 2015, formal charges were filed against Christopher for medical malpractice. During the courtroom proceedings, it came to light that Christopher had struggled with addiction for most of his life and had performed fewer than the ideal number of surgeries during his residency because of his heavy addiction. He had been reprimanded by the University of Tennessee several times for his actions, and was even arrested for driving under the influence, continued use of hard substances, and other crimes long after his license was revoked. In 2015, prosecutors tried to persuade the judge that Christopher's incompetence was more than just mistakes. He was repeatedly told that his actions during surgery would lead to devastating results, but he never listened.
I'm just so grateful from the bottom of my heart. This will not bring my mother back, but it is some sense of justice.
The trial lasted for 2 years, but in 2017, the jury took less than an hour to deliberate and return with a guilty verdict. Today, Christopher is serving a life sentence with a minimum of 30 years before he would be eligible for parole. Jayant Essa.
We are here today for the sentencing of Jayant Essa. I believe at this time, Mr. Dever, to the state of Ohio, if you have anything you'd like to address with the court.
In 2005, Rosemary Essa lost consciousness while driving, crashed, and was rushed to the hospital, where she passed away soon after. Suspicion immediately fell on her husband, Yazid Essa, and Rosemary's family claimed he was responsible for her unaliving. Why? Because instead of staying and mourning his wife, Yazid fled the country and returned to Lebanon. It took police more than a year to finally track him down in Cyprus and, after a lengthy extradition process, return him for trial in the United States. On the day of her passing, Rosemary left to go to the movie theater with a friend. Her husband handed her a calcium supplement before she left. She then called a friend while on her way to the theater, claiming that she felt dizzy and nauseous. Rosemary also made it a point to inform her friend that she believed Yazid had laced the calcium pill with something. What was concerning about her passing was that Rosemary was almost at a complete stop when she crashed into a stop sign. The impact was not enough to contribute to her passing. It barely grazed her. But when paramedics arrived, she was frothing at the mouth. Friends and family members claimed that Yazid was emotionless at the hospital when they learned she had passed away.
7 weeks, looking at the devil in his eyes, and a blank expression.
Later, he sent an email to everyone, informing them that, by the way, Rosie was no more. When Yazid learned that he was being treated as a person of interest in his wife's unaliving, he threw a lavish party at his home, handed his 2 kids to his sister, and fled the country. An autopsy report later confirmed that Rosemary had been unalived by the calcium pill that was laced with potassium cyanide. When Yazid was eventually extradited to the United States, the prosecution claimed that he unalived his wife to pursue a bachelor lifestyle, have affairs, and live carefree.
Provide the apology to my mother, my father, my sister, my wife, my brother, Rachel deserve. Are you man enough? Are you? Forget that appeal. Stop wasting your brother's money. It's your last chance to save your soul.
He had made a lot of money as an emergency doctor and wanted to spend it only on himself, much to Rosemary's disapproval. The jury found him guilty, sentencing him in 2010 to life in prison. Harold Shipman.
If you want to become a serial killer, become a doctor, because nobody will stop you, and nobody did.
A criminal whose crimes were so prolific that they changed the face of the United Kingdom's medical system, Harold Shipman was tried and convicted of unaliving several elderly patients in his care, with some reports suggesting he unalived over 250 patients. Harold was a general practitioner working in Hyde, Greater Manchester, after obtaining a medical degree from the University of Leeds. His crimes started right after he began working in 1974 and lasted until his arrest in 1998. Kathleen Grundy, a former mayoress of Hyde, was found unalived in her home on June 24, 1998. Harold had countersigned her passing certificate and listed old age as her cause of passing. According to Kathleen's daughter, however, she was informed that Kathleen had changed her will to exclude her children, but had benefited Harold Shipman by several $1,000s from her estate. It later emerged that Harold had counterfeited the will. This was, however, the first time that he had counterfeited someone's will, and prosecutors alleged that most of Harold's crimes were not motivated by greed or money, and that with Kathleen, he simply saw an opportunity to retire before the age of 55. In any case, this slip-up opened up an internal investigation into Harold's career as a medical practitioner, and prosecutors revealed that almost every elderly patient in his care had passed away under mysterious circumstances.
Can you remember Lily Crossley at all? Okay, no answer.
One of the prosecution's key witnesses was a taxi driver who claimed that none of the patients he had taken over to Harold's clinic had made it out alive, even though they went in near perfect health. Prosecution also revealed that some of the doctors who had worked with Harold also suspected him of malpractice, but their concerns were never taken seriously. Harold had written in his notes that all of his patients were addicts or had become seriously addicted to pharmaceuticals shortly after treatment ended. The prosecution, however, revealed that Harold would prescribe them abnormally high doses of heavy prescription substances, leading to their untimely passing. Harold would then countersign their passing certificates and cremation documents, evading coroner's reports and autopsies that would have uncovered his malpractice. While the jury was convinced of his guilt and returned with a life in prison sentence, Harold maintained his innocence.
Have you considered the question as to whether these individuals may or may not have been morphine naive?
Yes, I think in every single case they were.
Even when he was sent to prison in 2000, Harold refused to conduct any interviews or take part in any programs where he would have had to admit his guilt. His wife, Primrose May, stood by him but started questioning his innocence around 2004. That was allegedly Harold's breaking point, and in 2004, he unalived himself in his cell. Elizabeth Wettlaufer. Elizabeth Wettlaufer is one of the most prolific serial unalivers in Canadian history, but she does not fit the typical stereotype of an unaliver. Why? Despite the fact that she had attempted to unalive close to 14 people, she was also a beloved registered nurse at the time of her arrest. When she was finally arrested for her crimes, Elizabeth claimed that she knew the difference between right and wrong, but that she was motivated to unalive because of her surges. Elizabeth's career as a nurse started off typically. She worked as a nurse at care homes around the London and Ontario area and was well regarded by the people she worked with and cared for. However, her employers at Crescent Care started getting nervous when she would show up to the hospital inebriated. Elizabeth was placed on temporary suspension, ordered to take a rehabilitation course, but was ultimately let go when she prescribed the wrong medication to a patient. Elizabeth continued her spree at other care homes before she eventually confessed to her crimes during a rehabilitation session. She claimed that she was motivated by her unnerving desire to unalive and targeted elderly patients, since their passing could be attributed to old age. Altogether, Elizabeth administered lethal doses of insulin to 14 patients, 8 of whom passed away. In 2016, she was arrested for her crimes, tried, and sentenced to life in prison. Su Ying, Lisa Teng.
It is the judgment and sentence of this court that due to the seriousness of the underlying charges, the defendant shall be denied a probationary sentence.
Lisa Teng was a licensed doctor practicing in Southern California. She operated a successful storefront medical office and reportedly turned over more than $5 million in profit through her practice. However, prosecutors claimed that she was an unqualified doctor who repeatedly falsified medical records, did not conduct proper evaluations, and would prescribe unusually high doses of medication to her patients, leading to their passing. In court, she claimed that while she was responsible for writing out those prescriptions, she was not liable for her patients' passings. Her defense team tried to argue that Lisa and other doctors across the United States lacked proper training in prescribing addictive substances. It seemed like she was blaming the victims for taking the prescriptions in the first place. While she apologized to her victims' families in court, the judge ruled that she was a danger to society and sentenced her to 30 years to life. Jayant Patel.
It has always been my belief, and continues to be my belief, that I am innocent of the charges against me. But that does not mean that I do not understand the pain and suffering of others. I know how hard it is to lose someone you love, and how it feels to relive that misfortune again and again. In that trial, allegations were made not only about my competence as a doctor, but also going to the root of my character and my decency as a human being. I defended myself in that trial and will continue to do so.
After graduating from MP, Shah Medical College in India, Jayant Patel relocated to the United States, where he pursued further training at the University of Rochester School of Medicine, became a U.S. citizen, and started practicing in New York. However, Jayant's skills as a medical official were questioned several times, with medical investigators in Buffalo claiming he would refuse pre-surgical examinations on his patients. By 2000, New York withdrew Jayant's license, but he had already moved to Oregon before his license was suspended. His co-workers at Kaiser Permanente Hospital alleged that Jayant would operate on patients when he was not on the roster, operate on other surgeons' patients, and operate unnecessarily. In 2004, 4 of his cases were reviewed by the Oregon Board of Medical Examiners, where they found that 3 patients had passed away because of Jayant's incompetence. His license was revoked, but Jayant continued to practice medicine. Why? Because while he was a disgraced physician who had his license revoked, his peers and superiors at the hospital gave him glowing recommendations. By 2003, Jayant had relocated to Australia, where he got the position of Director of Surgery at the Bundaberg Base Hospital, an area of need in Australia. Despite having no technical qualifications, Jayant was accepted for the role. By 2005, serious concerns about Jayant's medical malpractice were raised. Nurses claimed that they would hide their patients from him while he would make his rounds, looking for people to operate on. Between 2003 through 2005, he had unalived 87 patients and then forged their certificates to hide his inadequacies. According to nurses and doctors, Jayant would operate unnecessarily on patients, had little to no regard for hygiene, and would operate on patients he was not supposed to. When the medical review board started investigating, Jayant panicked and left to go back to Portland, United States. However, once the board determined that Jayant's negligence was criminal, they had him extradited back to Australia, where he would face charges of manslaughter for at least one of his crimes. The initial charges against Jayant were deliberated, and he was sentenced to 7 years imprisonment. A retrial was filed, and the original charges were dropped, but Jayant served a 2-year suspended sentence for fraud. While Jayant Patel is technically a free man, he is barred from medical boards across the world from practicing medicine. Ben Geen nurses at Horton General Hospital in Banbury, Oxfordshire, started noticing a disturbing pattern. Patients who had come in with minor injuries such as dislocated shoulders would suddenly go into respiratory arrest while under the care of Ben Geen. He was alleged to be a nurse who was always looking for action. According to prosecutors, Ben would administer lethal doses of substances to his patients, forcing them into a respiratory arrest, and then attempt to resuscitate them. Ben admitted that he was a thrill seeker, and even though he was not registered in the emergency ward, he would be there whenever he could. He also claimed that there was a jinx on him and that patients would become inexplicably ill whenever he was around. Prosecutors later revealed that he carried lethal doses of substances in his scrub's pocket. Ben, a trainee nurse, was present in at least 18 cases where patients fell into sudden respiratory shock. They claimed that he seemed elated whenever his patients went into distress. An internal investigation was called, and Ben was found with a needle filled with vecuronium. The needle was worn, even though needles were supposed to be single-use. Ben refused to take accountability for the needle in his possession and unloaded it in his pocket when he realized he was being searched. He claimed to have accidentally taken the syringe, but that was highly suspicious. Criminal charges were filed against Ben. Charges included 2 unalivings and many more attempted unalivings. In 2009, 5 years after his conviction for unaliving and a life term, a third victim reportedly was unalived because of negligence he had suffered while in Ben's care. David Moor.
If someone is already suffering badly and their loved ones observing that, and that the option is to relieve that suffering, to allow someone to relinquish into a peaceful passing, that should be a beautiful thing. It should never be associated with fear of legal repercussions.
It is important to remember that David Moor was acquitted of the unaliving charge brought up against him in 1999, but he himself admitted to unaliving close to 300 patients in his care. According to David, however, the patients he had unalived were all mercy unalivings and that he could not be held responsible for the crimes. In 1997, David was responsible for the care of George Liddell, an 85-year-old former ambulance driver and widower who was suffering from cancer of the bowel. While George had a surgery to remove the cancerous part of his bowel, he was in considerable pain throughout his life. David and a team of nurses were responsible for his care, and the doctor prescribed 5 milligrams of diamorphine for his pain. But George's pain kept getting worse, and according to his daughter, he was suffering from depression in 1997. One day, when the pain got uncontrollably worse, George administered diamorphine and chlorpromazine, a combination that would ultimately end George's life. The crime would have gone unnoticed until David himself gave an interview to the Sunday Times in 1999, where he said, "This week I helped 2 patients on the way to a pain-free release from their painful agony and suffering." He also claimed to have administered lethal doses of diamorphine to patients who were terminally ill and would have required hospice. In David's eyes, he was not a criminal, and his patients wanted an end to their suffering. However, this led to criminal charges being brought against him. While the jury decided he was not guilty, the toll of the case led to David being ostracized as a doctor, his wife leaving him, and a spiral into alcoholism. He passed away in less than a year, at the age of 53. Niels Högel.
Facing justice, but not the cameras. Niels Högel was once a nurse charged with helping patients, but in court he admitted to killing scores of them.
When German nurse Niels Högel was arrested in 2005, He was originally charged with the unalivings of 6 patients. However, later probes into his medical career revealed that he might have been responsible for the passing of over 84 patients. After completing his vocational training in 1997 at the Sankt Willehad Hospital, Niels became a nurse and continued working there. From then onwards, the hospital reported an 85% spike in patient passing or resuscitation attempts. In all of those cases, Niels was the nurse, on duty. He claimed that after a meeting was held discussing the spike, he took a 3-week leave, during which only 2 patients at the hospital passed away. Niels later claimed that he took the leave of absence because he believed he had been caught. Niels was a part of the nursing staff in the critical care ward of the cardiac surgery unit. He was later transferred to the anesthesiology unit, where a spike in patient passing started. He was then sent to the logistics unit before transferring to the Delmenhorst Clinic. In 2005, after a string of crimes, Niels was eventually arrested when nursing staff saw him manipulating a patient's syringe with an abnormally high dose of medicine. He was arrested a few months afterward. Prosecutors claimed Niels acted out of boredom and the desire to show off his resuscitation skills. The trial lasted for a long time, beginning in 2005 and lasting until he was ultimately sentenced in 2014. The prosecution could only charge him with 6 unalivings, but later inquests revealed that he was responsible for close to 100 passing. A 2019 psychiatric evaluation of Niels also revealed that he had a personality disorder and was incapable of feeling empathy or remorse. Niels is currently serving a life sentence in prison. Colin Norris.
Colin Norris, a nurse at the hospital, stood trial and in March 2008 was convicted of one of the worst medical crimes in history.
Colin Norris originally worked as a travel agent before deciding to retrain as a nurse at the University of Dundee. Colin was known for being quick to anger and having aggressive confrontations. His behavior towards university lecturers was described as unacceptable. During his studies, his tutor tasked him with reviewing the conduct of Jessie McTavish, a nurse who had been convicted of unaliving a patient with insulin, though her conviction was later overturned. This allegedly inspired Colin, as he learned that insulin was the perfect substance for unaliving, since it left the blood very quickly. After qualifying as a nurse in June of 2001, Colin began working at Leeds General Infirmary. It was not long before he fell out with experienced authority figures. He made it known that he disliked working on minor injury wards or with elderly patients, preferring the emergency department because it was more exciting. The hospital later discovered he was secretly working as a nurse in other hospitals when he claimed to be off sick or attending training. Colin's spree began in May of 2002, exactly when his detailed probationary monitoring ended. He targeted elderly women who were admitted to non-emergency orthopedic wards simply suffering from broken hips. On May 17, 2002, Colin injected a patient with an unnecessary dose of a pain-killing substance to make her drowsy, followed by a massive dose of insulin before going off shift. The patient suffered a sudden hypoglycemic attack but miraculously survived. However, over the next few months, Colin used this exact method to successfully euthanize 4 other elderly women. The turning point came with the passing of Ethel Hall. Suspicions were heavily raised when Colin explicitly predicted to a fellow nurse that Ethel would become unwell at exactly 5:15 in the morning, claiming he had a feeling about her and complaining about having to fill out her paperwork. True to his prediction, at around 5 in the morning, Ethel suffered a catastrophic hypoglycemic coma. When a doctor ordered blood tests, they discovered an inexplicably massive amount of manufactured insulin in her system, about 12 times the normal level. Ethel was not a diabetic and had never been prescribed the substance. Hospital records showed that Colin was the last person to access the fridge where the insulin was kept and the last person to see Ethel before her collapse. A subsequent police investigation reviewed the passing of 72 people who had passed away while Colin was on duty. Independent medical experts confirmed that multiple elderly women had been given lethal injections of insulin. Colin was arrested in 2002. He maintained his innocence, claiming he was just unlucky, but the jury saw through his facade. In 2008, Colin was found guilty of 4 counts of unaliving and 1 count of attempted unaliving. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 30 years. Martin MacNeill.
I amended the cause of death in this case and added, in addition to cardiovascular disease, the possibility that drug toxicity may have played a role as well.
Friends and family members were disappointed when they learned that Michelle Martin had married Martin MacNeill. She was a straight-A student, a cheerleader, an aspiring model, and a regular member of the LDS Church. She met Martin during the church's youth group, and soon enough, the two eloped. Martin later served a 6-month jail term for forgery and theft. Still, the couple remained married from 1978 for over 30 years until Michelle's passing in 2007. Trouble started in their marriage around 2000, with Michelle alleging that Martin had been having an affair with his patient. Michelle caught Martin looking at women online several times, and the two fought often. The couple had 8 children, 4 biological children, an adopted granddaughter, and 3 adopted children from Ukraine. The children alleged that Martin had threatened to unalive himself and Michelle several times. In 2007, Martin proposed the idea of getting a facelift for Michelle. While she was initially apprehensive, he convinced her it would save their marriage. However, according to prosecutors, Martin had asked the surgeon to prescribe Michelle high doses of 2 substances that would not have been typically required for the procedure. Michelle had a slow recovery after the procedure and suspected that her husband was tampering with her prescription. The couple's daughter, Alexis, was responsible for her mother's medication, and Michelle was seemingly recovering fine while under her care. A day later, after she had left, Michelle reportedly passed away from a cardiac attack. On Alexis's request, an autopsy was performed, and it was determined that Martin had administered a lethal dose of medication. Prosecutors claimed that he almost got away with the perfect crime. On the day of Michelle's unaliving, she had reportedly confronted him about an affair he was having with Gypsy Willis. 2 weeks after Michelle passed away, Martin brought her to the house, claiming she had been hired as a nanny for the couple's youngest 2 children. In 2012, after repeated concerns by the couple's children and Michelle's relatives, an inquiry was started into Martin, leading to his arrest. Gypsy Willis agreed to testify against Martin in exchange for a lighter sentence. She claimed that Martin had informed her of his plans to unalive his wife, and claimed that he knew the perfect way to do it, too. After a 22-day trial, the jury returned with a guilty verdict, sentencing Martin to life behind bars. However, in 2017, 4 years after being incarcerated, Martin unalived himself in prison. Anthony Garcia. As of 2013, Anthony Garcia is the only doctor in the United States on Capitol Row. His crimes spanned from 2008 through 2013 and involved the unalivings of 4 people, the youngest victim being 11 years old. Anthony was described by his superiors as rude and dismissive, and several of his superiors claimed that because of his arrogant attitude, he was unfit to practice medicine. Anthony had tried to complete a pathology residency, but was terminated from the program after harassing another resident and his wife. This meant that he never completed his degree and was unable to train elsewhere because of the complications that followed him with his termination. According to prosecutors, this angered Anthony, and he started plotting his revenge. In 2008, he unalived the 11-year-old son and the 57-year-old housekeeper of his former residency supervisor. The case went cold because no leads were found. Then, 5 years later, Anthony unalived another one of his supervisors and his wife. He then tried to break into another supervisor's home. The investigators in the case noted similarities in all 4 unalivings. The victims were stabbed with kitchen knives found at the home. After a thorough investigation, they found that Anthony had been bitter because he was unable to find employment following his termination. He also bought firearms that matched the unaliving weapon in one of the cases. Anthony maintained his innocence in court, but the jury determined that he was guilty, sentencing him to capital punishment. Valerie McDaniel and Leon Jacob. In 2017, Valerie McDaniel recorded an audio message on her iPad, informing everyone that she had plotted with her boyfriend, Leon Jacob, to hire a hitman and unalive their respective exes. Valerie was a veterinarian who was in a bitter custody battle with her ex-husband, and Leon was a medical resident who could have his residency terminated if his ex-girlfriend testified against him in a stalking charge. After recording the message, Valerie unalived herself, leaving Leon to face the charges alone. According to prosecutors, Leon and Valerie met in 2016, moved in, and started talking about marriage. They also talked about their past relationships and hardships. Valerie had been married to Mac, who owned half of her clinic, and together they shared a 9-year-old daughter. Leon had just been released on bail for stalking, with the trial still underway. During his brief stay, he met and befriended a man named Zach, who promised to carry a hit out on Megan and Mac for the couple. Zach later agreed to become a witness for the police and recorded conversations between him and the couple where they discussed the plot. Police then set a scene to make it look like the unalivings had been successful and informed the couple. Immediately, the two offered alibis before even being treated as suspects. Moments later, they were arrested. 2 weeks later, when Valerie was released on bond, she recorded her final moments on her iPad and then jumped off her 7th-floor balcony. Leon faced the jury alone in 2018, claiming that he was not responsible for Valerie's self-unaliving and that he never intended to hurt Megan. His defense attorneys argued that he wanted to get back together with Megan and believed he was hiring a private investigator and not a hitman. The jury was unmoved by his defense and sentenced him to life in prison. Robert Neulander, Bob, and Leslie Neulander were believed to be a power couple. He was a successful OB/GYN, and she was a former nurse turned stay-at-home mother for the couple's 4 children. On the outside, everything seemed perfect. The couple lived in a massive home in New York. They were philanthropists, and Bob ran a successful practice. However, according to Leslie's friends from her book club, she was thinking of leaving her husband and moving into an apartment soon. The couple had troubles, but Bob claimed Leslie never brought up divorce. In 2012, the couple's daughter called 911, claiming that her mother had slipped and fallen in the shower and was now unresponsive. When paramedics arrived, they found that Bob had moved Leslie to the bed to perform CPR on her, but she was already deceased. What investigators found peculiar, however, was that there was a massive pool of blood in the bathroom. This was strange considering how Leslie had apparently passed away from a closed head wound. They also saw that Bob had a wound over his eye and that there was a wound on the side of Leslie's head. Investigators, however, did not pursue the case themselves. Leslie's friends started piecing together clues and brought evidence in front of state attorneys, claiming that they believed Bob had unalived his wife. The case went to trial with Bob maintaining his innocence, but the jury agreed he was guilty. Bart Corbin. Bart Corbin was a wealthy, board-certified dentist living what appeared to be a picture-perfect life in the upscale suburbs of Atlanta. However, beneath his charming facade was a deeply controlling narcissist who refused to let the women in his life leave him. Bart's dark history began in 1990 while he was still a dental student. When his then-girlfriend, a 27-year-old student named Dolly Hearn, broke off their relationship, Bart ruthlessly stalked and harassed her. Months later, Dolly was found unalived from a gunshot wound in what was initially and tragically ruled a self-inflicted passing. Bart escaped justice, graduated, and eventually married Jennifer Corbin in 1996. By 2004, their marriage was crumbling. Jennifer had begun an online romance and was planning to leave him. Enraged by her actions, Bart filed for divorce, but refused to let her walk away. In December of 2004, Jennifer was found unalived in their home with a gunshot wound to the head. Once again, Bart staged the crime scene to look like she had taken her own life. Fortunately, detectives saw through his lies and immediately linked Jennifer's passing to Dolly's eerily similar 1990 case. The walls rapidly closed in on the disgraced dentist. In 2006, Bart pleaded guilty to both unalivings to avoid the death penalty. He was handed 2 concurrent life sentences and remains behind bars today. Thomas Michael Dixon. In 2008, Thomas Michael Dixon met and started dating Rochelle Shatina. Thomas was already married at the time of the affair. Their relationship lasted from 2008 through 2010. She accused the plastic surgeon of being controlling and broke up with him. In 2011, she started dating Joseph Saunier, a pathologist she met at dance practice. They continued dating until he was unalived in 2012. During this time, the prosecution claimed that Thomas tried repeatedly to get back together with Rochelle. She also claimed that she felt like she was being watched. David Shepherds was named a person of interest in Joseph's unaliving after he confessed to a friend that he had been hired to stab and shoot the doctor. David later told police that he committed the act after being paid 3 silver bars and a box of Cuban cigars by Thomas. David later claimed that Thomas did not hire him for the unaliving and that he was only responsible for stalking the couple. He claimed he acted in impulse, and Thomas was released in 2014. Then, in 2015, the case was brought to trial again after David's daughter claimed that her father was under pressure to take back his testimony and that he had in fact unalived Joseph on Thomas's orders. The case was reopened, and Thomas was sentenced to life in prison. Deepak Desai. Deepak Desai was once one of the most powerful and wealthy gastroenterologists in Nevada, but his blinding greed ultimately led to one of the largest public health crises in United States history. After completing his medical education in India and his residency in New York, Deepak established a highly lucrative endoscopy clinic in Las Vegas. Despite his outward success, red flags were abundant. Nurses and staff members alleged that Deepak was obsessed with speed and maximizing profits, often demanding that his doctors perform an impossible number of procedures in a single day. Complaints of unsafe practices were filed, but his political connections and wealth shielded him from immediate consequences. To cut costs, Deepak ordered his staff to reuse single-use syringes and vials of propofol, a heavy anesthetic substance, across multiple patients. This catastrophic medical malpractice culminated in 2007, when a massive hepatitis C outbreak was traced directly back to his clinic, infecting over 100 patients. When health authorities finally intervened and raided the clinic, the sheer scale of his negligence came to light. Several patients who contracted the virus eventually passed away from severe complications. In 2013, Deepak was put on trial for his crimes. The jury found him guilty of second-degree unaliving in connection to the passing of at least one patient, alongside dozens of other criminal charges. He was sentenced to life in prison, where he ultimately passed away in 2017. Farid Fata. Farid Fata committed one of the worst medical crimes in American history. After training at a top cancer center, Farid opened his own clinic in 2003. Soon, his business grew across Michigan, and he was seeing over 17,000 patients. He hid his extreme greed behind a fake European protocol, which was really just an excuse to give patients dangerously high doses of chemotherapy. There were major warning signs. In 2010, an experienced cancer nurse saw him needlessly pumping patients full of toxic substances and reported him, but the state ignored her warnings completely. Farid's evil plan was simple but terrifying. He told perfectly healthy people they had cancer. He scared his victims into getting aggressive, completely unnecessary treatments. This left them with missing teeth, organ failure, and ruined lives, all while he stole over $34 million from insurance companies. The nightmare finally stopped in 2013. Another doctor at his clinic found out Farid was forcing a healthy woman to get chemotherapy for the rest of her life. The FBI stepped in and arrested him. In 2014, Farid pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to 45 years in prison, meaning he will likely spend the rest of his life locked away for the pain and untimely passing he caused so many innocent people. Conrad Murray.
We, the jury in the above entitled action, find the defendant, Conrad Robert Murray, guilty of the crime of involuntary manslaughter.
Conrad Murray was hired as the personal physician for pop icon Michael Jackson during the preparations for his 2009 This Is It comeback tour. Conrad was being paid an astonishing $150,000 a month, a staggering sum that ultimately blinded him to his medical oaths. Michael had a long documented history of severe insomnia and a dependency on heavy substances to help him sleep. Instead of treating the underlying issues, Conrad enabled him. He began improperly using propofol, a highly potent surgical anesthetic, as a nightly sleep aid, a practice entirely unapproved for home use. On June 25, 2009, after a sleepless night, Conrad pumped Michael with a cocktail of heavy substances, culminating in a fatal dose of propofol. Worse, he administered this dangerous anesthetic without the required medical monitoring equipment and abandoned his patient to make personal phone calls. When he returned, Michael was not breathing. Instead of immediately calling for emergency services, Conrad botched his resuscitation attempts, performing CPR on a soft bed rather than a hard surface, and delayed calling 911 for nearly an hour to hide the evidence.
Our sympathies go out to the Jackson family at this time for the loss that they have suffered. Not a pop icon, but a son and a brother, and I think that's most important.
The paramedics arrived too late, and the 50-year-old singer passed away. In 2011, Conrad was tried, and found guilty of involuntary manslaughter. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison, forever cementing his legacy as the doctor who unalived the King of Pop.